Now that the heir is born, you're of no use to me. Leave the kid and get out. We don't have the luxury to provide for a freeloader. David's words left me feeling dizzy. All this time, I had been working hard for David. But all that awaited me were his harsh words, treating me like an object. Just because he's my husband doesn't mean he gets a free pass for everything. David crossed a line that should never be crossed as a human being and a husband. That is something I can never forgive. Slowly, I could feel my feelings for David cooling. What remained was nothing but resentment towards David. That's why I decided to make David's life a living hell. My name is Karen Connolly, a 38-year-old homemaker. I live with my husband David. David's family runs a well-known resort hotel. Currently, my father-in-law manages the business, but David is next in line. David is busy every day trying to become a competent manager. Of course, I fully understand how challenging it is to be a business owner. Thus, I had been striving every day to support David as his wife in the future. In the midst of this, I became pregnant with David's child. David has no siblings, and since this child is our first, if it's a boy, he would definitely be David's successor. When David heard the news of my pregnancy, he was overjoyed. Finally, I'm going to have a child. You must give birth to a boy. I couldn't sleep well out of worry because we didn't have an heir. His words seemed to suggest that a child of any other gender wouldn't be valuable. It took us a while to have a child, and before we knew it, I was already 38. Whether or not we could have another child was uncertain. Maybe he said it unconsciously, but David's words weighed heavily on my heart. I must give birth to a boy. But what if it's a girl? Overwhelmed by such fears, I attended regular health checkups. David never once accompanied me to these checkups. Of course, he's busy with work and often out of the house, but even on his days off, David would just relax at home and never offered to drive me to the hospital. Alone, battling my fears, I went to a regular checkup that day. Then, it was confirmed that I was pregnant with a boy. In that moment, I felt as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had successfully become pregnant with a boy. From then on, I did my best to ensure a healthy birth. I thoroughly researched prenatal nutrition, and even when morning sickness took away my appetite, I forced myself to eat nutrient-rich meals for the sake of having a healthy baby boy. Absolutely, give birth to a healthy boy, because he's going to be my successor. If a child with any problems is born, our hotel won't be able to continue running. You have a big responsibility. Every now and then, David would put this pressure on me. Each time he said such things, it felt like a heavy burden was being placed on my shoulders. The thought of our child not being born healthy terrified me. But at the same time, I felt guilty towards the baby in my womb. As a mother, no matter what kind of child is born, I should love them. Yet somewhere inside me, I harbored feelings like, you must be born with a healthy body. Towards my unborn child, I felt as if I was projecting my own burdens. Whether it was due to mental stress or not, my health continued to decline. My morning sickness was so severe, I often found myself throwing up shortly after eating. According to my in-laws' belief that families should dine together, David always made sure to be home for dinner after finishing his work. The usual routine was him eating the dinner I prepared, then relaxing afterwards. But lately, as soon as I eat dinner, I feel a wave of nausea and end up rushing to the bathroom, hand over my mouth. It's been happening more and more. Seeing this, whether out of annoyance or concern, David always sighs and says, again? Getting all dramatic about how sick you feel just ticks me off. I get it, pregnancy is tough, right? But doesn't that seem a bit over the top? Women all around the world go through the same struggles and get over it just fine. Why can't you handle it like everyone else? You lack a sense of responsibility as a wife. I'm sorry. David scolded me almost daily. After throwing up, the fatigue was already unbearable. Yet, when I came back, I'd be showered with harsh words from David. My physical illness was compounding the fragility of my mental state. David's words, flung at me during those moments, often brought tears to my eyes. Do you think crying will solve everything? What you're doing is failing as a wife. A wife should try to create a comfortable home environment for her husband. I'm scolding you because you're so immature. But crying about it, really? Looking into my teary eyes, David let out a deep sigh. I understood that it was pitiful to cry over such matters. I knew that as David's wife, I needed to pull myself together. I understood it in my head, but my heart wouldn't follow. On the contrary, in my heart, I blamed David, wondering, why can't you be more supportive? Despite the fact that David was working hard at his job. The pressure of being the heir to a famous hotel chain must have been daunting and strenuous. And yet, I was constantly disappointing him. His words, "You're failing as a wife," stung me deeply. And that sting, like a stake driven into my heart, didn't go away. In fact, every day, more stakes were driven in, and my heart was screaming that it had reached its limit. Despite everything, I did my best to support David in my own way. The baby in my belly was growing steadily, and the doctors said the progress was good. But giving birth doesn't mean it's over. In fact, thinking about having to raise a child made me realize that this was just the beginning. And that's why I tried to motivate myself to work harder. David didn't accompany me even when buying baby supplies. He always had different reasons. He was busy with work, had social commitments, wanted to relax at home, and so on. Seeing this, my mother-in-law offered to help. She drove me around in her free time to buy things for the baby. "Karen, I'm so sorry about this. David can be so thoughtless." My mother-in-law apologized every time we met. But I knew David was on the path to becoming the manager of a well-known resort hotel. I knew it would be difficult for him to find time since before we got married. Yet, his repeated actions that showed a lack of awareness as a father were certainly disheartening. Despite all the pain, I kept on going. Finally, my labor pains began and I was admitted to the hospital. However, even during my hospital stay, David didn't visit me at all. "I'm sorry you're feeling lonely. I told him to take a break from work and spend some time with you, but it seems he can only think about work," my father-in-law said apologetically. I understand that the heir to such a position must face various concerns. Indeed, as the heir, there could be concerns to be had. But to not even come see his hospitalized wife's face, what's that about? David only came for the birth. He wouldn't even hold my hand as I writhed in pain. Just stood by, merely watching. How lonely that made me feel. Even so, our baby was born healthily. The first cry echoing in the delivery room. Hearing it, I almost felt like crying myself. After the birth, things calmed down, and I was alone with David in the hospital. Since it was the first time in a while we were face to face, I was thinking about what to talk about when David said, "I have something to tell you." As I cocked my head, wondering what it could be, David began to speak. And then he said something outrageous. "Now that the heir is born, you're of no use to me. Leave the kid and get out. We don't have the luxury to provide for a freeloader." I felt dizzy at David's words. Of no use? Leave the kid and get out? Freeloader? What is David saying? I've been trying so hard for David's sake. I felt like something I had been holding onto for years was slowly slipping away. It was my love for David. Seeing him smiling smugly after betraying me so cruelly, anger began to well up within me. I won't feel satisfied until I thoroughly bring David down. I will do everything I can to make sure of it. With that resolve, I decided to take action. If that's the case, fine. On the day of discharge, I'll leave the kid and go, okay? I asked with a smile. David widened his eyes, perhaps not expecting me to agree so readily. Of course, I wasn't just saying those words for the sake of it. I truly believed it would be okay to do so. That's a relief you're quick to decide. Don't worry, I'll explain everything to our folks. After we get home, let's go through the attorney for the divorce proceedings. David, who initially seemed surprised, realized I was serious, breathed a sigh of relief, and said that with a smile. Of course, I didn't say that without a plan. Rather, I was convinced that by doing this, I could surely give David a nightmare. David didn't come to see me at all until the day of my discharge. He didn't even participate in the workshops planned by the hospital. While I had expected as much, I couldn't help but smile at his thoughtlessness. David really doesn't think things through. After a while, the day of my discharge finally arrived. I came back home carrying the baby. Then there it was, paperwork from the lawyer that David must have prepared in advance. Can you fill them out quickly? Don't tell me you've changed your mind. I'm all set to get a divorce. I won't say anything like that. I put the baby to sleep, feeling irked by David's words, and quickly filled out the paperwork. David had already filled in the parts he needed to, so the papers were soon completed. Well then, goodbye. Thank you for everything, I said. Then, I returned to my room, took only the bare minimum of my belongings, and left the house. Then, I decided to stay at my parents' house for a while. Seeing me arrive with nothing but the clothes on my back, my parents were worried. But as I explained that I had my own reasons for everything, they said nothing and served me a warm meal. After spending a pleasant time with my parents, the night grew late and I decided to go to bed. Being quite tired, I was able to fall into a deep sleep immediately. But a few hours later, I was jolted awake by the shrill sound of my smartphone. Rubbing the sleep out of my eyes and checking my phone, it showed more than 30 missed calls from David. There were also numerous messages pleading me to answer the phone, making it apparent that he was in a dire situation. David seemed more cornered than I thought. I almost laughed in satisfaction, but held it in. Wondering what the situation was, I decided to call him back.
Hello, is that you, Karen? It's Karen, right? Please, help me with the baby.
David began explaining the current state of affairs. After I left, David had tried to take care of the baby himself, gathering whatever information he could. But parenting isn't something you can just wing with knowledge alone. Plus, our baby was just born. It was undoubtedly demanding. David, who had never shown any interest in housework or the baby except as a means to secure his heir, was clearly unfit to be a parent. As I expected, David started to lose his nerve almost immediately. Exhausted, he went to sleep only to be woken up by the baby's crying. Although he was aware of the concept of crying at night, the reality exceeded David's expectations. Even when he finally got the baby to sleep, the crying would soon start again, disturbing his sleep. David seemed at his wit's end, unable to get a break from the relentless responsibility.
Please, come back home now. I didn't know it was this tough. I realized I can't do it without you. I'll forget about the divorce.
Come back home now? Forget about the divorce? That's ridiculous. It's not to my benefit at all. It's actually a loss for me. But David kept repeating desperately.
Come back. I can't do it without you.
If I still had feelings for the old David, I would have probably responded to these pleas. But I didn't give a damn about David now. I had no intention of reaching out to him. Sorry, but you need to give up. We just can't be together, no matter what. We're divorced, we're no longer a couple. I'm already being nice by answering your calls. Really, I couldn't care less. I was sure that no matter what he proposed, I would never consider going back to David. But David kept desperately trying to hold on to me. Despite the fact that he hadn't done anything for me when I was having a tough pregnancy. Even more, he had left all the childcare and its necessities to me. He didn't even come to see me when I was in the hospital. But when it came to the baby, he wanted to claim it as his own and kick me out. A sigh escaped my lips at David's audacity. Why did I ever marry such a man? Where did I go wrong? As if he couldn't comprehend my feelings at all, David was trying to keep me on the line with his desperate voice. It was so annoying.
I was wrong, I realize that now. I deeply regret it. I underestimated parenting, I had no idea it was this hard. I need you, Karen.
No matter how many times I say, I will never go back. Or,
we are divorced.
David refuses to hear me, instead repeating,
I can't do it without you, Karen.
Like a stubborn child. It was clear that he didn't intend to listen to a word I said. After all, David was still very much a child himself. David is like a child, never satisfied unless things go exactly his way. It's far from amusing considering his age. Regardless of what happens, I have no intention of getting back together, just so you know. Oh, but I would like to take the baby if possible. I'll be visiting your place soon to discuss this, okay? Even though he's David's child, a good-for-nothing man, I still love my baby. If David ends up having custody, I'm certain the child will suffer in the future. I returned to my parents' house to create a suitable environment to raise the child.
You're coming over?
Even though I clearly said, I want to take the baby, he seemed to only pick up on the part about me visiting, brightening his tone, which annoyed me. But I had no intention of going to get my child without a plan. For the sake of my child, I was going to retrieve him today at noon, and to prepare, I messaged certain individuals. I honestly wasn't expecting things to go smoothly, but when I explained the entire situation, these people got so angry, even through text, and said they'd go over to David's house right away. With that, all the necessary players were in place. Now, all I had to do was go to David's house. Realizing dawn had broken, I got ready and headed to David's. When I arrived, I noticed shoes that weren't David's by the entrance. Impressed by their promptness, I entered the house. There was David, sitting upright, surrounded by my in-laws. Upon noticing me, my mother-in-law acknowledged my presence and gestured for me to sit on the sofa. David stared at me as if pleading for help. Yes, the people I had called were my in-laws. I told my in-laws everything that had happened. My in-laws were absolutely furious at David's actions. As soon as they hung up the phone, they rushed over to David's, saying,
"We won't rest until we've given him a good talking to."
Apparently, when they arrived at the house, David was sleeping with earplugs in, the baby was crying loudly, and the house was in a mess. All this chaos after just one day without me. Despite wanting an heir and leaving the baby behind, once he had to actually take care of the child, he got tired and couldn't be bothered. Such behavior is unacceptable. According to my in-laws, they cleaned up the house and took care of the baby as soon as they arrived, but until then, the state of the house was dreadful.
It's really unbelievable. He can't live properly on his own, yet he treated Karen, who supported him all this time, so poorly and ended up kicking her out of the house.
My father-in-law sighed at David's inexcusably outrageous behavior. What David did is beyond forgiveness. If he was going to kick me out, he should at least be capable of handling the basic necessities of life on his own. But until the very end, he was dependent on me, and he kicked me out without a word of thanks.
I'm truly sorry for what my son has done. I can't apologize enough to you, Karen. I will make sure David reflects on his actions, so please, find it in your heart to forgive him.
With that, my mother-in-law glared at David. David reacted with a display of annoyance, exclaiming,
"Come on, Mom!"
Seeing David quietly submit in front of his parents, I couldn't help but chuckle. He was meek as a lamb. A stark contrast to the bullying attitude he had when it was just the two of us, and his repeated disrespectful remarks.
Enough! Apologize to Karen now.
My father-in-law yelled, causing David to flinch. My father-in-law glared at David with a piercing gaze. Startled by this, David blurted out,
I am truly sorry. I'll change, I promise. Please, forgive me."
In apology. His demeanor was so comical that I nearly burst into laughter right there. Perhaps unable to bear the feeling of his pride being crushed, David's arms were shaking uncontrollably. When I inadvertently let out a chuckle, David looked up and glared at me, as if trying to intimidate me. Seeing this, my father-in-law asked in a stern tone,
"David?"
No matter how much David resisted, he couldn't go against his in-laws. After all, they could decide if he would be the next CEO or not at their whim. Being scolded by his father-in-law, David fell silent and just looked down. I didn't want to waste any more time on David. After discussing future plans with my in-laws, I left the house I had lived in for a long time, taking my son with me. To be honest, I'd had a tough time for a long while. I was emotionally drained when I gave birth to my son. I can't afford to spend any more time for David. I have to lead my own life. I looked down at the face of the sleeping baby in my arms. A face that resembles both me and David. Yet, now I find my son truly adorable. Had I continued to live without peace of mind, I wouldn't have been able to see my child as cute. In retrospect, I'm glad I could settle various matters. Of course, David will likely suffer in the future. But that's no longer my concern. Subsequently, on the advice of my in-laws, I decided to demand alimony as a childcare from David. Initially, David was reluctant to pay the alimony, but under pressure from his in-laws, he reluctantly agreed. However, the condition was that his in-laws wouldn't help him out with the alimony payment. Most of the money David has is financial aid from his in-laws. That's why he threw a tantrum, saying he couldn't possibly pay hundreds of thousands in alimony by himself. Furthermore, my in-laws decided to disown David. They ousted him from the position of next CEO and apparently decided to have an employee they trusted take over. Having been cut off from his in-laws, and in debt from paying alimony, David is now struggling to make ends meet, doing odd jobs day and night. He seems to be trying to get in touch with me through mutual friends, but I had taken measures beforehand, so I should be fine. I later found a new house while raising my son at my parents' home. Luckily, it didn't take long to find a good house, so we moved in not long after and are now living just the two of us. I am currently working while sending my son to daycare, earning a living. There's a gap of a few years since I was a full-time homemaker, but I was able to fit into the workplace quickly, and I'm enjoying every day. I had my fair share of struggles and hard times. But now, I'm quite happy. I cherish this happiness and want to live on.